Andrew here, intern Isaac here. Pastor Don is away for a week, so we are going to try and fill his shoes and lead Emmanuel Connects this morning. Of course, it's easier said than done. We are both aware of that, so again, just be aware of, be gracious with us as we try to pull together this Bible study this morning. So the passage this morning is 2 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 12 to chapter 2 verse 4. So that's chapter 1 verse 12 to chapter 2 verse 4. And so you're going to want to take the time, just pause. If you've already started watching this, just pause and just read through that passage a couple of times if possible. And just make sure you follow the logic. And of course this study is going to make way more sense to you if you have watched Sunday's sermon. So you might want to even pause the video again and go back and watch Sunday's sermon, and then I think our logic, our train of thought will make more sense to you. I should say that we are in a Sunday school room this morning, so hence the kids' books if they're still in the shot. This is not Isaac's study. We were talking about that beforehand, that sometimes when pastors do a Bible study, you have all the big books behind, and then you've got Isaac with the kids' books beside him. But no, they are doing some work up in the sanctuary, and so we found a quiet spot in the church, so that's why we're in the Sunday school room. Anyway, so 2 Corinthians, the passage that we're going to look at is really to do with Paul's change of plans. Paul's change of plans, and that's kind of what ties it all in together, and Paul really defending why he changed his plans. And so again, thinking back to the relationship, like I don't know if you remember week 1 of the sermon series where Pastor Don had the posts with all the pieces of paper, and remember there was a number of visits and a number of letters, and so Paul went way back with the Corinthians, but the relationship, some turmoil had come into their relationship, and there was factions within Corinth who were actually using or trying to use Paul's actions against him, using Paul's actions just to say that he is not to be trusted. And I think they were trying to lever their way in to be the leaders and sort of say Paul was not to be followed. And so you pick up on that theme through 2 Corinthians. But one of the ways they picked on was that Paul had changed his plans. You see that there in verse 16. So here we are in Chapter 1 verse 16, I wanted to visit to you on my way to Macedonia and to come back to you from Macedonia and have you send me on my way to Judea. But he wasn't able to do that. His plans had changed, and these opponents of Paul had jumped on that and said because he had changed his plans, there was all kinds of character deficiencies that Paul had. And so that's why it's a sort of a small thing for us, like I think Don said, we change our plans all the time. It's really not that big a deal. At certain levels, we can change our plans. But for some reason, even though Paul had changed his travel plans, it was being tied to his conduct and character and all these different things as well. So that's kind of, if you think along those lines, that's what we are going to expand on this morning. So with that being said, I'm going to pass it over to Isaac here, and you'll see just that word boast. And so Isaac, we're just going to think a little bit about that word boast, and Isaac has a few questions and a little bit to say about that as well.
Yeah, so Paul uses the word boast quite a bit in his letters, in the other letters, but also in Corinthians here. We see it in verse 12, where he's boasting in his conscience. So normally when you think of boast, it's praising your own actions and efforts and that kind of thing. And here, it would kind of be out of character for Paul to be boasting in his own actions and stuff, but he is here. But we know that that's by the grace of God, and he clearly points that out. So our first question for you this morning is, Paul uses the word boast in verse 12 here, and would you say that he uses it in a negative, to be avoided way, or in a positive way? And then secondly, how do people use the word boast today? Okay, so now you've thought through that a little bit. We have a few passages for you to look at that we'll have come up on the screen here. And if you could just scan through these references and just ask yourself, what does Paul mean by the word boast in these references? So you can just pause the video once more and have a look through those. Okay, Okay, so now that you have a few examples of the negative use of the word boast, it just sort of reminded me of a few weeks ago when Pastor Don was talking about our thought process and how it's a huge percentage of our thought that is towards thinking about ourselves. And the same thing goes for when we're talking. We're often talking about ourselves and not necessarily thinking about others first. So Paul does discourage this type of boasting. And we just have a few more passages for you to look at. So they'll come up on the screen again. And then I'd just like you to think about what type of boasting Paul's discouraging here.
Okay, so let's just spend a few minutes thinking a little bit more of the accusations that Paul is facing. And there's three that you can see. And again, if you're listening on Sunday's sermon, I'm just really repeating what Pastor Don said. But I think it's just worth as I read each section, just pause and make sure that you're following the logic of what is being said. So the first thing you see there in verse 12 to 14 is that the accusation is that Paul is hiding something from the people, that he's twisting things, that Paul is devious. That's what they're trying to bring out, that basically Paul is not sincere, that Paul is not godly in how he handles things. And we're going to come back to why that would be so far removed from what Paul was thinking. We'll come back to that in a little bit. So that's in verse 12 to 14, you see that accusation that Paul is hiding or twisting things. Then in verse 15 to 22, you see that Paul is a vacillator, or that he says one thing and then he does another. Sometimes it's yes and then it's no. Sometimes it's no and then it's yes. He's always changing his mind. And so he can't be trusted because he's always, he'll say one thing but sort of do the opposite. Or say one thing and then to the next guy he'll say the opposite thing again. And so you get that accusation that Paul's words are not trustworthy. So just pause the video and think about that. Remember we talked about the role of an apostle and just the authority that their words would carry. So just pause the video and think about that. What would be the significance if Paul's opponents could discredit the authority of his words? What would be the significance in terms of his role as an apostle? And then the last accusation that Paul is dealing with is there in verse 23 and verse 24. And it's really that accusation that Paul is not willing to do the hard things. That in some senses that Paul is in the ministry to serve himself. And it's all about what he can get out of ministry. He lives life in a self-serving way. And then if something was going to be hard for him, he would take the easier option. So those are the three accusations that they bring against Paul. And what's really neat, like I sort of mentioned briefly earlier, is Paul's response is really to bring it back to who God is. Like in other words, the character of Paul as a representative of who God is, and that God is holy and that Paul has to represent that. And so I just want to highlight these things again. So if you look again, just pause the video and scroll through verses 12 to 14 and look at his argument of how does he say he has acted in their midst. So yeah, pause the video now and just look at Paul's actions. Did you pick up on that there? There, for example, where he was able to say that he had acted with simplicity and godly sincerity. So that's the first part. He's been simple. In other words, there's not a conniving, like there's not multiple layers. He's been sort of straightforward up front. It's not that he's trying to do one thing and do something else. But then that godly sincerity, he's going to mention all the way through just the importance of God is his witness and how the value of that, and that his conscience is clear, and those kind of things as well. And so he's going to use that as an argument as to what he's done. Now thinking about that, my conscience is clear. It's interesting because we all know that our conscience, we can be lied to. We can, in all good conscience, think we've done the right thing, but maybe we're missing something. And so Paul, back in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 4, there's a verse that's going to just put like a little clause as to, yes, Paul trusts his conscience as best as he knows by his conscience. He has done the right thing. But then there's like a little clause just to protect himself, aware that our conscience can mislead him. So again, just take a minute and turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4, and just see what is the final measure that Paul is going to measure, or who's going to finally essentially measure Paul's life. And so that's 1 Corinthians 4:4 is where you're going to want to look to for that. The other part that Paul's going to bring in is by the grace of God. Now you imagine, you're going to see this kind of in Paul's defense. As we work our way through the letter, you're going to see there was these opponents of Paul who came in and they were saying things like they were smarter, they were wiser, they were more eloquent in how they would speak. And you see the heart of Paul's defense here in 12 and 14, where he would say, it's not by earthly wisdom, but by the grace of God and supremely towards you. And what Paul is essentially saying is, his argument is, what I am, it's all God's grace. The only thing that I can rest in, it's all God's grace and what he has done for us. And so, again, that's the heart of his argument, is that he's trusting in God's grace. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes I struggle just to think about that. I'm maybe more aware of my failures, I'm more aware of limitations, I'm more aware of how that influences my ministry. And yet Paul is saying, look, everything is by the grace of God. Everything I've done is by the grace of God. And so, again, maybe just pause the video and just apply that a little bit. What shapes your thoughts about your effectiveness in ministry? Is it that awareness that by the grace of God, he's going to open doors and use you in many different ways? Or are you just more shaped by maybe what you're not, or I'm not as good as this person, or I always fail in this way? So think about that just for a few minutes, just about what shapes your ministry. Do you believe Paul's logic that by the grace of God, you are what you are, and that's enough? Or would you say, yes, by the grace of God, I am what I am, but there's a whole pile of deficiencies? So think about that for a few minutes. So then jumping down now to the second part, so 15 to 22. So this is, the accusation is that he was a vacillator. His yes and no, his words couldn't be trusted. And Paul's argument there, what is his defense there? You see there verse 18, is, surely as God is faithful, and our word to you has been yes and no, for the Son of God, Jesus Christ, whom we proclaimed among you, Silvanus and Timothy and I, was not yes and no, but in him it is always yes. For all the promises of God find their yes in him. That is why it is through him that we utter our amen to God for his glory. And it is God who establishes us with you in Christ. And so he's tying his words and saying that his words reflect God's words, right? And are connected to the character of Christ and what Christ has done. Did you pick up on that? Verse 19, just look at it again. For the Son of God, Jesus Christ, whom we proclaimed among you, Silvanus and Timothy and I, was not yes and no, but in him is always yes. So Christ can be trusted, and Paul is Christ's ambassador. Did you get that? Christ can be trusted, and Paul is Christ's ambassador. And Paul realizes the weightiness of that. And so he's basically, his argument is, if Christ's words can be trusted, then you better be able to trust Paul's words. You better be able to trust him. I don't know if you've ever had that experience where you're just aware that you have let God down, and you've maybe not taken those opportunities. But again, here Paul, at the heart of his argument, is saying, look, my words can be trusted because he got the significance of his words tied to Jesus' words, to God's words. Now just think about that as a group. I want you to think about the impact. Have you ever heard just of an illustration, not even an illustration, but of a real life example where a Christian, where their words couldn't be trusted? Maybe a businessman who had lied to make a deal, or just some experience like that. And just talk about the implications and the effects of those words, those untrustworthy words. And then, so that's the first part. So talk about the impact of words that can't be trusted in the lives of a Christian. Then talk about, secondly, how do we go around, or how do we go about making sure it's a priority that our words can be trusted, making sure that we are trustworthy in what we say. So those two questions, just pause and discuss that now. So now the last sort of defense that Paul gives is that he calls God as his witness. See there, verse 23, but I call God to witness against me. So in other words, he said, look, God can essentially end this argument right now. God could come and say that what Paul is saying is lies. So again, if you think about Paul appealing to God to be a witness when God is all-knowing, it's really, Paul is confident that he's done the right thing, and that he's not actually self-serving. Remember, that was the accusation he's answering, that he was self-serving, but really his primary goal was their joy. It was the glory of God. Maybe I should be more careful how I say that. His ultimate goal was the glory of God, but he was also concerned with the joy of the Corinthians, not the joy of Paul, although he's going to bring out how those are connected. And so again, I'm going to pass it over to Isaac, and he's going to just expand a little bit on joy in this passage.
So yeah, Paul placed a huge emphasis on unity with them, and that he is working for their joy so that they can stand firm in their faith. And something that's a theme throughout the first chapter and this first section of chapter 2 is Paul's emphasis on their unity together as a church and as he is with that church. So I have a couple more passages for you to look up, and question to think about through those is, why is it such a big important thing that Christians are united in suffering and joy and also comfort? So why don't you pause the video and take a minute to read those and think through that. So Paul is very clear that the church is a body in some of his other passages, and we're to work together to serve Jesus, but also to lift each other up and to be ministering to each other. And something Pastor Don had mentioned last week was what it would look like if you were to spend a whole week just seeking after the joy of others in your life, whether it's at your workplace or at your home. So I just one more question of, what would it look like for you to spend a week doing that practically, and why is it actually so hard for us to get ourselves to do? So you could pause the video one more time.
So what answers did you guys come up with? Why is it so hard to make joy in others a priority? I don't know about you, but I find it hard, and I think it can be a little bit of culture where we're being squeezed into where it's all about us. And even in the church, I think that has crept in, where I know I've came and thought, oh, you know what, the worship leaders are a little off this morning, and maybe Pastor Don's not preaching as well, and focus on it wasn't quite to my taste, sort of that kind of response. And then you need to catch yourself on and realize, hold on a second, I've just got it backwards, that it's not really about me, but rather I need to be finding ways in which I can build others up. And so one sort of practical way, and I don't do it every Sunday, but as often as I remember, I try to always pray before I come to church, hey Lord, would you today make me a blessing to somebody else? Would you use me to bring joy to somebody? And I think it's not so much about me reminding God that needs to be a priority, as much as even in praying that, it just helps me to have the right mindset of, I want to go and be the means that God would use to bring joy to other people. And so just to be intentional about that, I think is really important. And then that other, in terms of Isaac's question as to how do we bring joy, what would it look like to bring joy, make that the priority for a week? I just want to come back a little bit to that, the way that Paul is answering. And remember, Pastor Don had mentioned just the importance of us being, as it were, little Christs, right? That was the slang term that was given to the early Christians. And yet the early Christians embraced it, because their accusers were saying, hey, just in everything you do, you're just trying to be like Christ. It's like you're little Christs. And the Christians were like, yeah, that's right, we are. And so again, just in terms of an application question for you guys to discuss, what would it look whenever you see the importance of character and our words and even the unity and joy? What would that look like for us to represent Christ well this week? So think about that. That's just something else. You can stop the video and think that through. And then just two other questions that you don't necessarily need to stop the video, but more just things for you to unpack, because this is not just about material and having more knowledge, but really the goal of our study today, even what we're praying that God would use this to make you more like Christ, and God would use it to make us more like Christ. And so then it's worth not just sort of taking in the knowledge, but also applying and seeing how is this going to change my life today? How it's going to change my decisions today? And so my question would be, is there something that you need to change in light of this study? Is there something that you need to change in light of this study? And that would be a question I'd encourage you to prayerfully just to consider, and say, God, hey, look, as my witness, God, is there something that you think I should change in light of this passage? And then the last question, just that's going to be connected to that, is, do you need prayer about that? Is there something that you would ask your group for prayer? We want in the small groups just a level of transparency and trust in one another. And so I would just encourage, even within the groups, just to keep what is discussed within those groups. But the part of the keeping the confidence is so that there will be a growing transparency, and so that there will be just a willingness to ask for prayer. Hey, would you pray for me in the area of my tongue? Because I just, I speak way too quickly, or I just, my temper is there, and I just say things that I shouldn't say. Just for example, maybe that's something that you want to ask your group. I want to be more like Christ in how I speak. So would you pray to that end? And so I want to encourage you to be courageous and just to think about that, and then just to ask your group even for prayer along those lines. And then group, make sure you follow up on that in a couple of weeks' time. Ask them, how's it going? Ask them, hey, in terms of how you've used your tongue in the last couple of weeks, have you been more accountable in that? Have you been more like Christ? And so those are 2 follow-up questions. So I think that's probably enough to keep us going for this week. And we're just going to close in prayer. So Isaac, do you mind actually just closing our time off in prayer, please?
Yeah, dear God, we thank you for this time we have to study your word together, and thank you for the example of Paul's life that he gave and that you preserve for us to read now. And I ask that as we go into this week, we would be just reminded of this, and reminded of just how important it is to be joyful, and to be helping others to be joyful as well, and building into each other's lives. And I ask that you would guard us against being boastful, whether it's in our thoughts or in what we say, and pray that you'd be with us too as we go throughout the week, and just help us to apply everything we've learned today. And we thank you so much. We pray this in your name. Amen.
Amen. Awesome. Thanks again for joining us.